We're in Revelation chapter 20, and there's only 15 verses in this chapter, but there's 15 heavy verses in this chapter. I was constantly kind of torn. There's a lot of theological debate about what's going on in this chapter, and I kind of wanted to address that, but then there's really important spiritual significance to what's happening here. And my goal is to really focus on the really important spiritual significance of what we're doing. So to set this context a little bit, Babylon's been defeated. We covered that in 17 and 18 and had kind of some going back over some of those details there in chapter 19. The believers have joined Christ for the marriage supper of the Lamb. Christ has returned, defeated his enemies, and declared himself as king. The beast and the false prophet have been cast into the lake of fire. In chapter 20, we see the fate of the dragon, which is Satan, those who reign with Christ in the millennium, and those who are judged at the great white throne. So this is some monumental things happening here in this short chapter, these 15 verses. But let's dig into it a little bit. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while. So now we've come to the most explicit passage on one of the most controversial topics in eschatology, the millennium. This is the thing that we're all debating over when we talk about premillennialism and amillennialism and postmillennialism. It's all based on this little 6-verse section of Revelation 20, where different people are trying to figure out what are we talking about here. And we'll talk just a little bit about those different ideas. But like I said, I want to focus on what's important here in this passage. There's nowhere near enough time to evaluate all those positions here, but I want to point out a few key ideas. They give us some clues about which position interprets this correctly. And the first is the very first word of that chapter. It's the word then, here in the New King James Version, which translates the Greek word kai. But I point that out just to say that we just went through Revelation 19. We just talked about Jesus returning and destroying his enemies. And very importantly, here in this context, throwing the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire. And then it says, and I saw an angel. And there's no indication in this context that we've moved on to a whole new topic. In other words, the clear way to interpret this is that we're still kind of carrying in the same sequence, the same series of events. So we throw the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire, and then this angel comes down. And that's the clear, basic interpretation of this text. If you want to tell me, as the amillennialist does, that when we talk about this millennium, all of a sudden we're going all the way back to Jesus dying on a cross, and that's when Satan was kicked out of heaven, and that's when he was bound, and that's when this millennium started. You're putting something in that text that just isn't there. The text just says, and I saw an angel, and this event happened. So just the word then, or the Greek word kai, at the very least, it doesn't indicate a change in the context. It doesn't indicate that we're talking about something entirely different and new. It seems natural to interpret that this is just the next thing that happens in the story. The next thing, clue in there to what we're talking about is the dragon. It says an angel comes and lays hold of Satan to bind him in the abyss. The abyss is just the bottomless pit. I'm used to saying abyss, so I put it in here in the notes. New King James Version says bottomless pit. It's just the Greek word is abyssos. So it's the same thing. Bottomless pit, abyss, same thing. But the angel comes to lay hold of Satan to bind him in the abyss. The amillennialist says that Satan is, when it says that he's bound, it just means that he's limited in what he can do here on the earth. Well, That's been true forever. You can read the book of Job in the Old Testament. Satan was limited in what he was able to do. He could only do what God allowed him to do. But in this case, we're given a place. He's bound in the abyss. This makes sense with the previous section because we've just been told that the beast and the false prophet are cast into the lake of fire. Right? But then there's one more key player, right? There's one more key player besides the beast and the false prophet, and that's Satan. And we haven't yet been told what happens to Satan after Jesus returns. So it would make sense if in this context we're going to be told what happens to Satan. So again, it makes sense if we're just carrying on the same story and this stuff happens after Jesus returns. It seems odd to think that when we are told what happens to Satan in the very next verses, some theologians are interpreting that as a description of something that happened 2,000 years ago. Meaning the amillennial interpretation is that Satan was bound when Jesus was crucified. Furthermore, it doesn't seem as though Satan has been bound for the last 2,000 years to me. Seems to me Satan's still alive and well right now. And as a matter of fact, we could point to Paul in Ephesians saying, right, our war is not against flesh and blood, our war is against powers and principalities, and he goes on to talk about the armor of God. He's talking about spiritual warfare. Well, if our main warfare as Christians is spiritual warfare, it's because Satan is not bound right now. Satan is still out there. And the idea that we are currently living in the millennium with Satan bound and unable to tempt or distract or influence, that's just not what I'm seeing in the world around me. That interpretation doesn't make much sense to me. And so it makes much more sense to think that after the return of Christ, after the beast and the false prophet are thrown in the lake of fire, Satan, for whatever God's purpose, decides not to throw Satan into the lake of fire yet, but instead to bind him in this place called the abyss, so that for the next 1,000 years, Satan cannot influence the events going on the earth. And so then let's talk about this abyss, or this bottomless pit, because this isn't the first time we've seen it. We've seen it a few times already in Revelation, and in one very interesting time that we'll point out in Luke chapter 8. But these verses don't just say that Satan is bound, as in, that he's just limited in what he can do, but it specifically says they bound him in the abyss. Now, if you go back and you look where we've seen the abyss before, it comes up in Revelation chapter 9. It was I can't remember off the top of my head. I believe it was the fifth trumpet. Yeah, the fifth trumpet, in which these demons, the locust demons, the size of horses that tormented people for 5 months, if you remember that story out of the fifth trumpet, it says that they were released out of the abyss. So the abyss is this place where there are demons that are stored up now. The interesting story in Luke 8, if you remember Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac, this guy comes up and he's possessed of all these demons, and Jesus speaks to them and he says, "What is your name?" And they say, "Legion." And it says that they begged him not to send them to the abyss. Here again, even in Jesus' day, it would seem that the abyss was a place where demons might be sent. Just reading that context, it seems like that was a place where maybe some demons got sent if they got out of line or something. Maybe there are limits to what they're allowed to do, and if you break the rules, then you end up going to the abyss. But whatever that interpretation is, Jesus is confronting these demons, and they say, "Please don't send me to the abyss. Let us go into these pigs." And Jesus grants that wish, and they go into the pigs, and the pigs all run into the sea, and they all drown. It's a real weird story, but we can come back to this and say the abyss, then, is a place. It's not just an abstract thing. It's a place where demons are held for whatever reason.
Bad behavior.
For bad behavior.
How else would they behave?
Go stand in the corner.
Yeah. Go sit in the abyss. 1,000 years for you in the abyss. But this is what we're told. We're told that Satan is bound in the abyss. He is told he has to go there and he has to stay there for 1,000 years. I I don't see any way with all of the other verses that reference the abyss, I don't see any way to look at that and say, oh, well, this just means that Satan is stuck on the earth, but there's certain things he's not able to do during this time period. Seems like, no, I think he's sent to a place and he has to stay there. And so one of the key characteristics of the millennium is this fact that Satan is bound. I have said two keys here. One is the presence of Jesus, and the other is the absence of Satan. For a whole 1,000 years on the earth, that's what happens. And so the fact that John uses a specific place where Satan is said to be bound means to me that it doesn't make much sense to figuratize that, to allegorize that, and to make it just mean that he's just limited in what he can do. I think we've got a 1,000-year period where Satan's not able to influence the earth. And so I kind of just stuck that millennium to summarize what I've said here, is that I think the millennium then is best interpreted as a literal earthly 1,000-year reign of Christ, in which the defining characteristics are the presence of Christ and the absence of Satan. This is what we're all heading towards. This is what has been promised for all of these hundreds and thousands of years, is that there will be a time when Jesus reigns on the earth and when Satan's influence is eliminated for a period of time, and we can just live with Christ in a, not necessarily a perfect world. There will still be fallen people that exist, but in a world that generally is under the control, under the lordship of Christ. And so that's verses 1 through 3, and we can look a little bit more at, maybe try to get some more keys about what's going on during this millennium. So chapter 20, verses 4 through 6, it says, "And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years." So the first feature of the millennium is that we have the presence of Christ and the absence of Satan. But then the other part of it is who gets to be there with him. And one way or another, that's us. We get to be there with him. But I wanted to talk about, there's two things. If Jesus is reigning, who is he reigning with, and who is he reigning over? And so I just kind of wanted to throw these ideas out there. The first 3 verses of this chapter tell us who isn't invited to the millennial kingdom, Satan. And the next 3 tell us who is. There are 2 basic questions about who's involved in the millennium. Who does Jesus reign with, and who does Jesus and his fellow reigners reign over? And so I kind of titled this first section, Jesus' fellow reigners. If you're wondering, reigners is not a word. I just made it up. Microsoft Word didn't like it, and I just ignored Microsoft Word and stuck it in there anyway. Verse 4 simply says, "I saw thrones, and they sat on them." That's how it's in the New King James, but I pulled out what do they call that? A parallel, interlinear Greek New Testament. It just says they sat on them. It doesn't say, it doesn't really say who they is. So we're left to try and figure out who is they. But we do have some clues. I think there's some good reason to figure out who they is that sat on them. We know that the tribulation martyrs will be resurrected to reign with Christ because they are specifically mentioned later in this same verse. However, they seem to be mentioned in addition to whoever they is. So again, who is they? And I'll give you a couple of things that I think. I think it will include all believers who are no longer in earthly bodies. This will include Old Testament saints who have been promised a resurrection when their people are redeemed. I'm going to stop for just a second, go ahead and read this, Daniel chapter 12. This is Daniel talking about the end times, and he's just been talking about the tribulation a little bit. And he says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as has never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So Daniel says that there's going to be this tribulation, and then there's going to be an end, and there's going to be a resurrection. And those who are written in the book of life will be resurrected. And so I think it's safe to put that also in this context here in Revelation 20 and say that here at the end of that great time of trouble will also be a time when those saints such as Daniel, the Old Testament saints, will be resurrected, and they will be invited to be a part of this millennial kingdom. I think this will include the church, whether we think they've been raptured recently before this or they were raptured 7 years before this. The church is going to reign with Christ here. And in fact, it's really interesting, and maybe I'll stop just for a second and read some of these verses as well. Going back through, we spent a lot of time back when we were in chapter 2 and 3 talking about the overcomers. It was all about the overcomers there, and I think those are the people who end up reigning with Christ here in the millennium. I want to read just a couple of these verses out of the 7 letters to the churches, the 7 descriptions of the overcomer. 4 of them are directly referenced again here in chapter 20 of Revelation. So I thought I'd just kind of read and remind you of some of that. In chapter 2, verse 11, it says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." In verse 26, it says, "The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father." I thought that was interesting. He mentioned ruling with a rod of iron, just like Jesus rules with a rod of iron. And here in that text it says, "They will rule with a rod of iron, even as I myself have received authority from my Father." So it is those overcomers who reign with Jesus. In chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot out his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels." And finally, in verse 21, it says, "To the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." And so, 4 out of those 7, when it describes the overcomer, we are directly seeing that fulfilled here at the end in this millennial kingdom. So we're definitely talking about the church that also reigns with Christ, as well as Old Testament saints and those martyrs who became believers during the tribulation and were martyred. So those are who reigns with Christ. Whoever is a believer and is no longer in an earthly body will reign with Christ in the millennium. And then who are the subjects of Christ's reign? If all believers who are no longer in earthly bodies will reign with Christ, then who are they reigning over? Furthermore, who will repopulate the earth during this time, since most, if not all believers, will be in resurrected bodies which don't reproduce? You can look at Matthew 22:3, where it specifically says, Jesus is asked about marriage, and he says, in the resurrection, there is no marriage, but we're like the angels. And so we're not going to reproduce anymore when we're in heaven in our resurrected bodies. And yet, we'll talk about a little bit later in this passage, how there's an army that rises up against Christ that numbers greater than the sand of the seashore. So somewhere, you've got to have an innumerable army. Now you got 1,000 years to get there, but at some point you've got an innumerable army rising up to rebel against Jesus. So we have to figure out, where does that army come from? How are we going to get there? How do we populate this millennium? The answer to this question depends on your view of the rapture. The pre-tribulationists will expect the millennium to be populated by those who accepted Christ during the tribulation. This is what Tom was talking about earlier, when you have the marriage supper of the Lamb, and those believers who accepted Christ during the tribulation would then populate the millennial kingdom. So it's really a fairly straightforward, simple answer for the pre-tribulationist. It's one of those that, as a post-tribulationist, this is a constant thing that comes up. How are you going to populate the millennial kingdom? And so the answer there, in the post-tribulational view, there will be no left behind believers to enter the millennial kingdom. If anyone escapes the tribulation, and some must escape, they will have to be unbelievers when the rapture happens. This requires taking the statement in Revelation 19:17 through 18 and 21 not quite literally. If we come back to that, this is where, then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly overhead, "Come gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, small and great." And verse 21 it says, "And the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh." So that clearly seems to imply we're talking about everybody. Everybody dies. And so if everybody dies, post-tribulationism doesn't work. So how do we work that out? And here's what I would say, is that I have a hard time thinking that literally everybody's killed. And to give one example, I have a hard time thinking that Jesus, who says he's going to use the sword himself, is going to kill all the children. If there are any children alive, I have a hard time thinking Jesus is going to run a sword through a 9-year-old and say, you should have believed in me. And I mentioned before, I think, that we said, maybe somebody sees Jesus coming in the clouds with the church and says, "Okay, never mind, I'm out. I don't want this fight anymore." Maybe there's a second chance for that person. I don't know. And it makes perfect sense to say there's not a second chance for that person. And that Jesus comes in and says, "No, it's too late." And you could even argue that Jesus would take out the kids. Like that sounds real bad. That's what happened when the Israelites went to the Promised Land. God told them, the men, the women, the children, everybody. And you could make a case that maybe that's what happens. But from my view, I have a hard time seeing Jesus putting a sword through a kid. And so I would say that maybe that's who survives, and those kids then have a chance to repopulate and grow up. But that is one of those questions that we have to have this millennium as premillennialists, meaning that we think the millennium is still future. There has to be some explanation of how do we populate? What does that look like? That's one of the challenges. I was listening to some debates recently over the past few weeks, trying to wrap my brain around some of this Revelation stuff. And I listened to one that was pretty interesting, between a premillennialist and an amillennialist and a postmillennialist. Wow. And that was, they kept hammering the premillennialist on populating the millennial kingdom. And he was a post-tribulational premillennialist. And so it kept hammering him on it. But anyway, that's something you have to think through. If we're going to say that the millennium is future, what does that look like? And that's a constant challenge of, how do you make the world work in a future millennium? But all of that is, side note, theology debate. The important thing, the important part of this passage is the presence of Christ and the blessing it is to take part in the first resurrection, to be his priests and to reign on earth with him. As long as I'm there for that, I'm content to figure out what the rest is when I get here. This is, again, what the real important thing is. The idea of Jesus himself living on this earth, and not even like he was the first time, in a humble, low situation as a carpenter and a traveling rabbi, but as king of the earth, as somebody that makes right all the wrongs that have constantly been around in this world. As long as mankind has been in charge of the earth, governments have run poorly, people have done bad stuff, wars have happened, and one day we will have a king that will run things well. Chapter 20, verses 7 through 10. Now when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. They went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. If the premillennialists are right, and I think they are, then Armageddon will not be the last battle between man and God. Even when Jesus has proven not only his existence, but also his divinity for 1,000 years, the people of earth will still follow Satan into one last massive rebellion against him. This is one of those that kind of blows my mind, and it's crazy. I was reading one commentator, and he made a point that I guess helped me to wrap my brain around a little bit. He said, once Jesus is visibly here on the earth, and he's there, and you can see him, and he's teaching, and he's preaching, everybody will pretend to believe in him. Everybody will give lip service to Jesus, because it will be obvious that you wouldn't want to cross him. You wouldn't want to be outside of the rest of the group. And he said there will be a lot of pretend believers in that day. And we'll kind of have to change the meaning of believer at that point, because everybody will believe Jesus exists. But how many people will acknowledge him as their rightful king? How many people will have any affinity for him, and how many instead will resent and rebel and hate? I had somebody ask me one time, in one of the first Bible studies I ever taught, he said, do you think that the Roman soldiers who crucified Jesus were saved? And I said, well, there was like the one guy, right? There was the one guy that said, surely he was the son of, but other than, he was like, no, I mean like all of them. All the people that participated in his crucifixion, were they all saved? And I said, well, I don't think so. I couldn't figure out what he was saying. Like, where's this question coming from? What do you mean? I don't think all of them were saved. And he said, well, they know Jesus died on the cross. They watched it. And I kind of had to, let me rethink how we're saying this a little bit, because he's grown up in this, kind of a kid version of if you believe Jesus died on the cross, then you're saved. And I said, well, we got to think a little bit more into this. That it's not just a matter of recognizing that Jesus exists, or even the fact that he died on the cross, but there has to be a moment of saying, that's my Savior. That's my Savior on the cross. And in the millennium, people will have to look at Jesus on the throne and say, that's my Savior on the throne. And there will be a lot of people that will probably say that with their mouths, but won't believe it in their hearts.
They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me.
Exactly. And out of those, Satan will build an army and rebel once more against Jesus. This will be a global battle fought by an innumerable army from all nations of the earth. It seems incredible, but many will reject Christ, even though they have seen him with their own eyes. When Satan is released from the abyss, he will find willing followers who will perhaps have been giving lip service to Jesus and his kingdom, but who have no real faith or love in their heart for him. Many people have debated the identity of Gog and Magog and searched Ezekiel 38 and 39 for clues. And by the way, if you're interested, I did watch a video that was really interesting from a guy trying to argue that Gog and Magog are Turkey. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with him, but he made some really interesting points. It's worth looking at, a little 9-minute video talking about Turkey as a major center of biblical prophecy, and he at least made some good points on that. Just briefly, all 7 cities that of the churches that were written to in the beginning of Revelation. They're in Turkey. And there's a lot of little things, but I really don't think we're going to figure out. I don't think it makes sense to try to connect Gog and Magog to a country that currently exists, because we're talking about the end of the millennium. We're talking about after Jesus comes and destroys every nation and every kingdom and becomes the king of the earth, and whatever happens 1,000 years later, I mean, maybe has some connection to now, but I don't see how we're going to figure that out. I think we have to say Gog and Magog are people groups that exist 1,000 years after the millennium starts, and that's all there is to it. I don't think we're going to have, is it Russia, is it Turkey, is it China? Well, Russia, China, and Turkey won't exist anymore, so I'm not sure where we go with that. So maybe they're actually called Gog and Magog, or maybe these are just given as kind of a symbolic similarity to the Ezekiel 38 and 39 wars that are predicted. But I don't think that we're talking about, I don't think that we can make a strong, solid connection to countries that exist now. We do know that no matter what the situation is in the world, Jesus will still have ultimate victory over Satan. It is after this final battle that Satan is overcome, never to return again. He will join the beast and the false prophet in the lake of fire, where he will remain for the rest of eternity. One more side note, theological point out of this on amillennialism is Satan is thrown in the lake of fire at the end of the millennium, and it says where the beast and the prophet are. So we connect back to the story from Revelation 19, and it seems very clear that this whole time the beast and the prophet have been in the lake of fire, and now Satan is being thrown in there with them. It really messes up the whole story, the whole context, if you say that we're going back in time and talking about Satan being bound back when Jesus was crucified and that lasting up to today. The flow just doesn't work if you try to make that case. But here we have the final battle. Jesus decides to prove his mastery over Satan one last time at the end of this millennium, and he wins his victory in a decisive victory in which God calls fire down from heaven and simply destroys this innumerable army that has gathered against God's people. And last, here, verses 11 through 15, then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And so we come to the second death. At this point, all the dead are raised, to be judged according to their works. This is the judgment we don't want any part of. We know from Romans 3:10 through 20 that if we are judged by our works, we will be found unrighteous. I want to read just the last of that little passage there. Revelation 3, verse 20. It says this, "For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin." If we're judged according to the law, and it doesn't matter which law you use, if we are judged according to our works, we come up short. And of course, that verse comes right before Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, but we have a righteousness apart from the law that comes to us by grace and through faith. And therefore we don't have to participate in the judgment where we're judged for our works." There are two references to books in this passage. Books that contain a record of works, and another book, the book of life. I like how it's said that way. It says books, and then it says another one. A different book that's not in this same category. And so the first reference to books has our works as a record of works. And those who stand in that judgment are judged by what's written in that book. But the book of life is not a record of actions, but of names of people who have placed their faith in Jesus. Of all the things we've read about in Revelation to be thankful for and look forward to, I think I'm most thankful that I will be exempt from this judgment. Blessed are those over whom the second death has no power. That ultimately, this judgment, and really avoiding this judgment, is our message. That is the gospel. That we don't have to stand in that judgment because of what Christ did for us when he died on the cross. That we can be saved and forgiven and have our names written in the book of life. And we can be judged by the faith we placed in Jesus, not by our actions that we've taken.